My rent here in Chiang Mai, for a modern one-bedroom apartment with a saltwater pool and a new gym, is $450 a month. I'm going to say that again, because it still barely makes sense to me. $450. Back in Texas, in the house I'd lived in for 40 years, I was paying more than that just in property taxes. Taxes on a big empty house I didn't even want anymore. Most people, when they hear that number, they assume that's the whole story. They figure I did the math, saw the savings, and made a logical choice to move to Thailand. And don't get me wrong, the financial side of it is incredible. But the crazy thing is, the money isn't the main reason I'm here. It's not the second reason, and it's not the third. The real reason is a lot harder to put on a spreadsheet. The real reason has to do with the difference between waiting for the end and starting a new beginning. To really understand why a 64-year-old man from Fort Worth would pack up everything he's ever known, you'd have to see what his life had become. You'd have to understand what it feels like when the silence in your own home is louder than anything on the television. To understand why I'm here, you first need to understand the quiet I was running from. For most of my life, my world was Fort Worth, Texas. For over 25 years, I ran my own company, Jenkins Cooling and Heating. I was the guy people called when their world stopped working, when the Texas heat became unbearable and the air conditioner gave out. I took a lot of pride in that. I built a good business, not by being a slick salesman, but by being honest and knowing how to fix things. I understood budgets, I understood mechanics, and I understood what it took to build something that lasts. I wasn't a rich executive. I was just a man who was good with his hands and who kept his word. And for 40 of those years, the heart of that world was my wife, Sarah. After she passed, everything went quiet. The house we'd built our lives in, the one where we raised 2 kids, suddenly felt like a museum. Just a big, empty space full of echoes and memories. My kids are grown, with their own families in Oregon and Florida. They're good kids, they call when they can, but they have their own lives to run. I was just here, rattling around in this big house, watching cable news, feeling like the credits had rolled and I was just sitting in an empty theater. Now I wasn't in financial trouble. Not by a long shot. I'd done what you're supposed to do. After selling the business to a guy who'd worked for me for years and selling the house, I had a nest egg of about $450,000. On top of that, my Social Security check came in every month, regular as clockwork, for $2,200. I was secure, stable. By every measure the world gives you, I had succeeded. But I felt like a ghost. I felt like my whole identity, husband, father, provider, problem solver, had been retired, and nobody had told me what was supposed to come next. Then 2 things happened, one right after the other, that just cracked everything open. First, I went to the dentist. A molar I'd had trouble with for years finally gave up the ghost. The quote for an implant, out of pocket, was nearly $3,000. $3,000 for 1 tooth. It wasn't that I couldn't afford it, but it felt insulting. Like I was just this machine that required expensive maintenance just to keep from falling apart. A week later, I was scrolling through Facebook, and a young guy who used to work for me had posted pictures from a vacation in a place called Chiang Mai, Thailand. I saw pictures of street food stalls steaming with food I'd never seen, lush green mountains that looked like they were from a movie, and just life. People everywhere smiling, eating, living. The contrast was a punch in the gut. My life had become this quiet, expensive, slow decline, and over there, on the other side of the world, it looked like life was a festival. That's when it hit me. I'd spent my entire career doing diagnostics on broken systems, figuring out what was wrong and how to fix it. It was time I did a full diagnostic on my own life. That thought, that one little seed planted by a handful of pictures on a screen, it wasn't just a fleeting idea. It was like a switch had been thrown. For the first time in 3 years, a system in my life was presenting a clear and obvious problem. And my brain, the part that had been dormant for so long, the part that knows how to fix things, just lit up. The problem wasn't the house, or the quiet, or the property taxes. The problem was that I was allowing myself to depreciate. I was a high-value asset sitting idle, losing value every day, waiting to be scrapped. And I decided, right there in the quiet of my empty living room, that I was not going to let that happen. So I did what I've always done. I went back to work. Except this time, the job was me. I didn't just browse, I conducted a full-scale analysis. For a month, I spent my evenings not in front of the television, but in front of my computer, with spreadsheets open. I approached the idea of moving to Thailand the way I would approach installing a commercial-grade cooling system in a building I'd never seen before. You don't just show up with a truck full of tools and hope for the best. You start with the blueprints. You analyze the load calculations. You study the schematics, identify potential points of failure, and map out your supply chain. For me, that meant 2 columns on a spreadsheet. In one, I listed every single expense of my life in Fort Worth. The $500 a month in property tax. The utilities that seemed to creep up every single year. The insurance. The gas. And at the bottom of that column, highlighted in red, I put that $3,000 tooth. That tooth became a symbol for me. It was the cost of staying put. In the other column, I started building a new reality based on what I was reading online. Rent for a modern apartment, $400, maybe $500. Food, so cheap it was almost unbelievable. Healthcare, rumors of world-class private hospitals at a fraction of the cost. I spent hours, days, weeks going deeper. YouTube videos, expat forums, Facebook groups for retirees overseas. I read the good and the bad. I wasn't naive. I read the stories about guys who had problems, who got sick, who found the isolation suffocating. But I approached each one like a diagnostic report. What went wrong? What were the warning signs? How do you prevent it? The more I read, the more the picture clarified. And the numbers in that second column kept looking better and better. But I'm a man who trusts ductwork more than he trusts dreams. I've seen too many systems that look good on paper fail under real-world pressure. The numbers were promising, but they were just numbers. I couldn't trade 40 years of my life for a YouTube video and a blog post. So I made the only decision a man like me could make. I decided to go see the job site for myself. I called it my reconnaissance mission. I booked a flight and a small, clean Airbnb for 1 month in Chiang Mai. I told my kids it was a vacation, but it wasn't. It was the most important business trip of my life. I flew over there with a yellow legal pad and a list of non-negotiables. I wasn't there to see the sights. I was there to kick the tires. My checklist was simple. First, infrastructure. Is the power reliable? Is the internet fast enough to video call my kids? Second, logistics. How do you get around? How do you buy groceries, pay bills, open a bank account? And third, the 2 biggest question marks of all, the visa and the healthcare. These were the load-bearing walls of the entire project. If either of them was weak, the whole structure would collapse. My first week there, I just walked. I walked everywhere. I watched, I listened, and I started to feel the numbers from my spreadsheet come to life in real time. I'd eat a full, delicious meal from a street vendor for $2 and just shake my head. I'd sit in a modern, air-conditioned coffee shop with internet faster than I had back home and pay $1 for a coffee. The streets were busy and alive in a way that Fort Worth just wasn't anymore. Not for me. I wasn't invisible here. People nodded at me. The woman at the little corner market remembered how I liked my coffee after the second visit. The infrastructure was solid. The logistics were manageable. Tuk-tuks, scooters, a perfectly functional app for everything. I found the grocery store. I figured out how the local SIM card worked. I opened a basic bank account just to test the process. Each thing I checked off my list, the picture got clearer. But the big questions remained. Online, the talk about visas was a nightmare. It was all about 90-day reporting, yearly extensions, endless paperwork, and the constant feeling that you were a guest who could be asked to leave at any moment. It sounded like being on permanent probation. I couldn't build a life on that. Then I met Dave. I was at a coffee shop, nursing a cup and going over my notes, and he just sat down at the next table. He was an American, about my age, and he had that easy, relaxed look of someone who has figured things out. We got to talking, and I laid it all out for him. My plan, my fears, my checklist. I told him my biggest concern was the visa instability. He just smiled, took a sip of his own coffee, and said, "You're working off the old blueprints, my friend. The whole system has changed." He was the one who told me about the 10-year long-term resident visa, the LTR. He pulled it up on his phone. He showed me the different categories, and right there, plain as day, was one for wealthy pensioners. He walked me through the requirements, a certain level of passive income, a certain amount in the bank. As he was talking, I was doing the math in my head, and it wasn't even close. I qualified easily. This wasn't a 1-year permission slip renewed at the government's whim. This was a 10-year long-term plan. It was the difference between building a temporary shelter and laying a permanent foundation. It was the first time I felt the ground beneath my feet in Thailand feel truly solid. That one conversation changed the entire calculation. It took the biggest risk on my list and turned it into the biggest asset. The second game changer came about 2 weeks later, and it was a lot less pleasant. I got sick. Really sick. A nasty stomach bug that laid me out completely. And I'll be honest, I was scared. Lying there in my rented room, feeling miserable and 1,000 miles from anyone who knew my name, I thought, so this is it. This is the reality. This is the part they don't show you in the videos. A friend suggested I go to the private Bangkok hospital Chiang Mai. I was picturing the worst, a crowded, chaotic emergency room, a language barrier, and a bill that would make my eyes water. Instead, I walked into a lobby that looked more like a Marriott hotel than a hospital. Everything was gleaming. A woman at a dedicated international desk greeted me in perfect, unaccented English. Within 15 minutes, I was in a private room seeing a doctor who had trained in the UK. He was patient, he was thorough, he explained everything. They ran tests. They gave me an IV for dehydration. An hour later, I walked out with a bag full of medication and a clear set of instructions. The whole experience was more efficient, more professional, and more pleasant than any hospital visit I'd ever had in the United States. Then came the moment of truth. I walked up to the cashier, my credit card already in my hand, bracing for the impact. She typed a few things and slid a small piece of paper toward me. The total bill, consultation, lab tests, the IV, and all the medication, came to 2,945 Thai baht. I just stared at it. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking a little, and typed it into the calculator. It came back, $85 US. 85. I just stood there, speechless. I thought of my $3,000 tooth back in Texas. That one piece of metal and porcelain was going to cost me 35 times more than a full, comprehensive treatment that had just pulled me through a legitimate medical emergency. It was more than a bargain. It was a revelation. It proved to me that my quality of life wouldn't just be cheaper here. In some very real ways, it would be better. But the final piece, the one that settled it for my heart, and not just my wallet, was the people. I had this picture in my head of what an expat in Thailand was. I pictured lonely men sitting at a bar at noon, nursing a cheap beer, with nowhere to go and nothing to do. I was terrified of becoming one of them. I was afraid that in running from the quiet loneliness of my house in Texas, I would find a louder, sadder loneliness on the other side of the world. And I couldn't have been more wrong. I started digging into the Facebook groups. There wasn't just one. There were dozens. The Chiang Mai Hiking Club, the Chiang Mai Pickleball Association, volunteer groups. Dave invited me to his regular Tuesday morning coffee meetup. I almost didn't go. I was nervous, genuinely nervous, like the new kid on the first day of school who doesn't know where to sit. But I forced myself out the door and down the street. I showed up at this little cafe, and around a big table were 12 people, Americans, Canadians, British, Australians, one guy from South Africa. They weren't just sitting there staring at their phones. They were laughing. They were arguing about politics. They were planning a weekend trip to a nearby national park. They were talking about their kids back home, their old jobs, their new lives. They were complaining about a bad restaurant someone had recommended. They were completely, thoroughly, ordinarily alive. They weren't ghosts. They weren't waiting for the end. They were busy. They were active. They were living. Looking at them, I realized they weren't running from something. They had run towards something. And I knew, in that moment, with absolute certainty, that I could be one of them. When my flight took off from Chiang Mai at the end of that month, I looked out the window at the mountains fading into the clouds below, and something inside me had fundamentally shifted. The reconnaissance mission was over. The data had been collected, the risks had been assessed, and the conclusion was clear. I had the visa answer. I had the healthcare answer. I had seen the community with my own eyes. Every box on my checklist had a check mark next to it. When I landed back in Texas and walked into my big, beautiful, silent house, it didn't feel like home anymore. It didn't even feel sad. It just felt inefficient. Like a machine that was still running, consuming power, without producing anything. It felt like a system that had outlived its purpose. The move was no longer a question. It was no longer an escape from the past. It was a logical, practical, well-researched business plan for the only thing I had left to build. The rest of my life. I'd done the diagnostic. I'd inspected the job site. The report was in. All that was left was to execute. So I called my kids, both of them, in a single call together, and I laid it all out for them. The numbers, the visa, the hospital, the people. My daughter asked if I was sure. My son asked if I'd thought about what happens if I get really sick. I told them both. I had thought about it. That's why I was doing this. I'd already tested the healthcare system. I was already thinking about the future. Then I called my realtor. Selling a house you've lived in for 40 years is a strange process. You're not just selling wood and drywall, you're packing up 4 decades of your life into boxes. I stood in the kitchen one afternoon, looking at the coffee maker Sarah and I had bought together at a store that wasn't even open anymore, and I just laughed. Not sadly. It felt like I was archiving the past to make room for the future. A record of a great life, carefully filed away so the next chapter could begin. And when that plane finally touched down in Chiang Mai for the second time, I wasn't a visitor anymore. I wasn't on a reconnaissance mission. I was home. And that word, home, felt better than I expected it to. The first month was a whirlwind of setting up. I found the apartment, the modern 1-bedroom with the saltwater pool. And yes, the rent was really $450. When I handed over the deposit, I felt like I was getting away with something. Like I'd found a pricing error on a website and was hitting confirm before anyone noticed. Back in Texas, my property tax alone was over $500 a month. Here, I was getting a gym with brand new equipment, 24-hour security, and a pool I could swim in every morning for less than that. The first time I sat on my new balcony, looking out at the mountains in the distance, with a cup of coffee and nothing urgent to do, it was the first time in 3 years that the quiet felt peaceful instead of empty. It felt like exhaling after holding your breath for a long time. But a nice apartment is just a place to sleep. A life is what you do when you're awake. I knew I couldn't just sit on that balcony all day. The system needed a purpose. I remembered seeing a post in one of those Facebook groups about a local school needing volunteers to help kids practice their English. I hadn't been in a classroom in 50 years, but I figured, I speak English. How hard can it be? So I went. I showed up to this little classroom with about 15 kids, all between 7 and 10 years old, looking at me with these enormous, curious eyes, like I'd just landed a spaceship in their schoolyard. We sat in a circle. They showed me their drawings, and I told them about Texas. I told them about trucks and football and snow, which they'd never seen. And I told them about this very apartment and the mountains I could see from my balcony. Twice a week, for a couple of hours, that room is the fullest place I've ever been. Their laughter fills up a space in me I didn't even know was empty. I'm not just a retired old man anymore. I'm Teacher Bob. And that was just the start. That hiking group I'd found online? I'm one of the regulars now. Every Saturday morning we're out there on the trails, a mix of Thais and expats. all breathing in that fresh mountain air. I've been to places up in those hills that aren't in any guidebook, trails that end at viewpoints where you can see 3 provinces at once. Dave introduced me to the pickleball crew not long after I moved in. I hadn't played a sport in 30 years, hadn't even considered it. But I went, and now I'm out there twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, sweating and laughing and arguing about whether a ball was in or out, and feeling about 10 years younger. My knee, which has ached for years, has never been better. I think it's the warm weather and the movement combined. I even bought a little scooter from a shop down the road. Paid cash, nothing fancy. Some weekends, I just pick a direction on the map and go. I've found temple complexes that weren't on any tourist map. Family restaurants where nobody speaks English and I just point at what looks good. Little mountain villages where people stop and stare at the old farang on the motorbike and then laugh and wave. I'm not just watching the world on a screen anymore. I'm out in it, every day. And here's the part that my practical HVAC technician brain still loves the most, because it's the part where the system proves it was designed correctly. After all of it, the rent, the food, the gas for my scooter, the weekend trips, the Saturday hikes, eating out whenever I feel like it, buying rounds at Dave's coffee meetup. My total monthly expenses come out to about $1,800. My Social Security check is $2,200. Let that sink in for a moment. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not just living, I'm living well, and my bank account is actually going up every single month. The system is producing more than it consumes. The project is running in the black. That $450,000 nest egg I worked my whole life to build, it's not getting drained by property taxes and $3,000 teeth anymore. It's sitting there in a brokerage account back in the States, untouched, growing quietly on its own. It's not just a safety net anymore. It's a legacy, something I can actually leave behind. And when I think about that, about the fact that I came here to find a life and ended up also securing the future, it's the most satisfying engineering outcome I've ever produced. It's been 3 years now. The silence I was running from in Texas is gone. It's been replaced by the sound of kids learning English, the smack of a pickleball, the sizzle of street food, and the easy laughter of friends who were strangers just a short time ago. I came here thinking I was just trying to find a cheaper way to live. I was wrong. I was finding a better way to live. The cost was just the key that unlocked the door. The guy who was rattling around a silent house in Texas, waiting for a tooth to cost him $3,000. He feels like a different person, a character in a story I read a long time ago. The quiet I have now, sitting on my balcony in the morning with a cup of coffee and the mountains ahead of me, it isn't empty. It's full. It's peaceful in a way that the silence in Fort Worth never was. The revelation, the real one, wasn't about the money. It was realizing that my life wasn't over. My story wasn't finished. I just needed to start a new chapter in a different book. And as it turns out, the next chapter is the best one yet. So if you're watching this, thinking about your own life, there are a few things I've learned that you need to know. These aren't things you'll read in a travel brochure. They're the things you learn after you've actually done it. After you've sat on the balcony and watched the sun come up over those mountains 300 times and thought about every decision that got you here. First, look beyond the money. The savings are real and incredible, but they're just the key that unlocks the door. The lifestyle is what makes you stay. I could have stayed in Texas, lived off my savings, and been financially fine. But I would have been living a smaller and smaller life. Here, my money buys me more life, not just more stuff. It buys me weekend trips, daily pickleball games, and the ability to take a new friend out for lunch without thinking twice. It buys me the scooter ride on a Saturday afternoon to nowhere in particular. In Texas, my income was for maintenance, keeping the machine running. Here, it's for experiences. You're not just retiring to a cheaper place, you're upgrading to a higher quality of life. That's a completely different thing. Second, and this is the most important practical thing I can tell you, the visa rules have changed everything. Stop listening to advice from 2018. The internet is full of old stories from guys who had to do border runs every 90 days and live in a state of constant uncertainty. That world is gone. Research the 10-year long-term resident visa, the LTR. Look up the wealthy pensioner category. Read the requirements carefully and honestly assess whether you qualify. Stability is now possible, and it makes all the difference between feeling like a long-term tourist and feeling like you truly live here. It's what lets you build a real community. It's what lets you become Teacher Bob instead of just the guy passing through on his way to somewhere else. And that brings me to the most important piece of advice I can give you. Book a 1-month trial run. Do not sell your house based on a YouTube video, even this one. Come here and live it for 30 days as a resident, not a tourist. Run your own reconnaissance mission. Go to the grocery store. Open a local bank account just to see how it works. Go to a hospital for a simple checkup and feel what that experience is actually like. Join one of the coffee meetups. See if it fits you, your personality, your rhythm, your needs. It is the single best investment you will ever make in the next chapter of your life. So if you're sitting there in a quiet house, wondering if the best part is over, my advice is to think again. The rules have changed, and so have the opportunities. Do the math, look up the LTR visa, and book a flight. You might discover you're not running away from home. You're running towards a new one. And if you want to see a real-world breakdown of exactly where every dollar of my monthly budget goes, the creator of this channel has a video on that right here.